We're back, and better than ever. Welcome to the third episode of Critical History. Today we're going to take a look at another fascinating episode of history, something we could easily discuss for hours, and when we get to 100 episodes, we probably will have. And that is the mystery of the Mongols. We all know the story: savage nomads, barbarians on horseback, vast herds of horses, brutally raping and pillaging across the entirety of the immense Eurasian steppe. They preyed on all they came across, and they swept across Eurasia. So what's the mystery? Let's go through the basics. Who, what, when, where, and why. Who? The Mongols. Now, usually we don't get to our first mystery this quickly. Looks like we'll have to get back to this. What? The Mongol invasions. Where? Across Eurasia, from China all the way to Poland and Hungary. A huge distance. When? The traditionally accepted chronology would be between 1206 AD to 1405 AD. Why? Who needs a why when we're talking about global conquest? Doesn't everyone dream about ruling the known world? Without ascribing the grandest of ambitions to the Mongols, we can safely say their initial goal was to unify the Eurasian steppe. What is interesting is that the reason for world domination is always the same, whether it is the Mongols, the ancient Chinese, or even today's United Nations. We are always told that world domination is the only way to bring about world peace. So let's start with where. Ultimately, the Mongols ended up conquering basically the entirety of the Eurasian steppe. Flat grasslands that stretch from the mouth of the Danube on the border of Romania and modern-day Ukraine, most of the way east to the Pacific Ocean. In other words, their style of combat was extremely well suited to this type of terrain. By and large, they were horse archers, and it was actually quite a low-risk way for them to engage with their enemies. The use of horses made them mobile and thus quite hard to strike, especially for an opposing foot soldier or infantryman. The bow, a special type of recurve bow, made them deadly from a distance. Recurves were made from a number of materials, not just wood, but also bone and sinew. This made it powerful for its size and easier to handle while on horseback. A wide variety of tactics made them unpredictable and thus extremely difficult to stop. To give three quick examples, they used the Parthian shot, which meant riding in one direction and facing backwards, firing in the opposite direction. The other, number two, would be the feigned retreat, which meant upon engaging with the enemy, you would actually retreat, and this would actually end up leading them into an ambush, or at least breaking up the enemy's formation. A third tactic was to entirely surround the enemy, or that is, almost entirely surround them. The Mongols found that once entirely surrounded, the enemy would fight to their last dying breath, whereas if you left a small avenue for escape, you could actually get the enemy to retreat, and that made them easier to cut down. Enough history. What's the mystery, I hear you ask? Well, there are a few. Firstly, it is wrong to assume that those that we refer to as Mongols today are the same Mongols of the 12th, 13th, and 14th century. But first, the intro. Now back to the Mongols. What do I mean that those who occupy Mongolia today aren't necessarily the Mongols of the 12th, 13th, and 14th century? Well, it appears that the Mongols at the time of the Mongol invasion of Manchuria would have been largely composed of Han Chinese, but the Mongols that invaded Eastern Europe would have been mostly of Slavic descent. Likewise, I imagine that those who invaded Iran and Central Asia were mostly Turkic. Why is that? Because at the time, the term Mongol was a sort of catch-all phrase for all ethnic groups that were part of the empire. This is why the term Turco-Mongol was used. And what I mean by that is Turkic tribes, Slavic tribes, and Han Chinese tribes that were all living in the same nomadic lifestyle ended up confederating, allying with each other. So they didn't fight against one another, and then when they engaged in war against their neighbors, such as invading Eastern Europe or invading northern China or invading Central Asia, the bulk of the soldiers would be the local ethnic groups. Now, the topic of etymology is always controversial, but that doesn't mean that we should avoid it. We just have to be careful not to run into a sort of feedback loop, a tautology, where our assumptions about chronology are then reinforced by etymology, which in turn has been influenced by chronology. So let me use some examples. Even today, in Serbo-Croatian, mnogo means many. This is the same meaning it had in Proto-Slavic. Megali in Greek, meanwhile, means great. So already we can see that when the term Mongol was used in Europe, it could have meant the empire of the many tribes, or it could have meant the great empire. The Mongol rule of India was called the Mughal Empire. While we're talking about etymology, it is worth mentioning the words we typically associate with the Mongols, Khan or Han, and horde. Now, this is actually very similar to the words used in medieval Europe, such as king, Konig, Cohen, and military groups were called military orders. So think of the typical British pronunciation, horde and order. Then there are, of course, the red-haired mummies that have been found. For example, in the Tarim Basin in the far west of China. The place with the reddest hair in the world today? Ireland, of course. We all know that. But also, did you know, Udmurtia in Russia? What's interesting is that Udmurtia is actually close to the portage that was used in medieval times to get to the northern Dvina, a river in northwestern Russia. And from there, they could use the river to get to the White Sea. So it would only be a little further to sail to Scotland and Ireland for them than Norwegians. None of this should come as a surprise, as although there were many different ethnicities living on the Eurasian steppe, they shared a very similar culture in terms of being pastoral nomads. They traveled everywhere with their herds out of necessity. You travel with the seasons and go where the food is. So that's the first mystery. Don't worry though, there are more. First though, I want to take a moment to mention Critical History's sponsor, Conquest of Truth, available on Kindle now. In 1302 AD, following the mysterious death of his father, the Duke of Styria, and grandfather, Rudolph, King of the Romans, Johann, just 12 years old, is forced to flee the Holy Roman Empire. Entrusted with a terrible secret by loyal Cistercian monks, Johann must solve the murder, become a man, and plot the destruction of the men responsible. Check it out. Back to the Mongols. A lot of the confusion is due to how modern scholars portray the Mongols: savage, illiterate, brutal. Now, admittedly, some of this is the fault of the Mongols themselves. This is because they were the first proponents of psychological warfare. In other words, they promoted the idea that they were brutal and savage in order to frighten their enemies into submission, or even possibly into allegiance. But were they really that savage? And were they uneducated brutes? Savage, possibly. Uneducated? I doubt it. Why do I say that? Because while we typically think of the Mongols as nomads with massive herds, they were also very successful in besieging walled cities. And what countries come to mind in modern days for technological prowess and powerful armies? America, of course, but also China and Russia. As the apocryphal story goes, NASA spent millions developing a space pen that could be used to write in zero gravity. Russia, meanwhile, used a pencil. Now, apparently graphite could cause an electrical short circuit, but why let the facts get in the way of a good story? So did the Mongols have technological prowess? Yes. Although modern historians tend to have a curious way of framing it, saying that Mongols captured Chinese technicians and thus learned how to use gunpowder. Curiously, the first battle reported to have involved gunpowder, the Battle of Ain Jalut in about 1260 AD, also involved the Mongols. Although many reports claim it was used against them by the Mamluks, others I have read have said it was the Mongols that used it against the Mamluks. Of course, it's even possible that both sides pioneered the use of gunpowder in this battle. Now, even to this day, Russia develops some of the most sophisticated artillery and rockets in the world. But didn't the Mongols conquer the Russians? Well, this is actually a rather interesting topic. Modern historians refer to the Mongol yoke, but Russian researchers are of the opinion that this is a modern recontextualization. Why? Because there aren't any Russian chronicles from that time that detail the conquest. And the yoke that they speak of is similar to the feudal arrangement that was in place in most of Europe at that time. The peasants had to serve in the king's army, although in the case of Russia, it would appear that a certain percentage of the population, a tenth, were enlisted as professional soldiers for life. For example, it's well known that the Mongols left a great deal of local Russian rulers in place. It is also well known that the Mongols exhibited extreme religious tolerance, very unusual for the time. They did not discriminate against any of their subjects based on their professed religion, but the Khans themselves considered themselves above religion. The rules of any given religion did not apply to them. We've already discussed the Mongol use of psychological warfare, but another reason for their reputation for brutality is because they were very clear what the terms were when laying siege to cities. If you surrendered, that meant you had to join the Mongol Confederation, and the town would usually be pillaged for 3 days. Although the lives of the citizens would be spared. However, if you resisted and the Mongols were successful in their siege, they would execute almost everyone. It seems only the most useful, such as engineers or the youngest of children, would be spared. It seems that their view was that once they had made the threat to slaughter all that stood against them, to not follow through would be perceived as weakness. As such, the same threat would not work on the next city that they laid siege to. This was actually the main reason they were able to expand so quickly. Most cities did surrender and agreed to join their confederation, although they were also very careful about not letting cities merely pay lip service to joining them. After you had allied with them, you had to partake in the next siege, and often as frontline troops. This was regardless of if you had family or friends in the town being besieged. It was also the Mongol Empire that ended up becoming Tartary or Tartaria in the centuries that followed. Now, there's a lot more to discuss on this topic, more mysteries to uncover, such as what happened to the Mongol Empire, but that can be covered in the future. Now, if you like this video, smash that like button, hit the subscribe, sign up for notifications, and stay tuned for the next episode. Until then, remember, stay critical.